Okay, I want to say hi to everybody. I'm going to tell you a little lie right now that I'm really excited to be here. I'm not used to doing live video like this, so this is a brand new experience for me. So be patient with me. I'm going to treat you as if you're all sitting in front of me and I'm teaching you at my retreat center. I've been teaching for almost 29 years now, and I'm quite experienced in the teaching process. Where you put me on the computer, I'm not quite as experienced with that. But so today what I want to do is, we have this little pattern called tea time, or is it tea time? Yeah, tea time placemat. I'm not good with my names either. And it's a very popular pattern. And so we were trying to come up with a simple demonstration for all of our students today. And one of the things that we decided is the vein. We have a lot of patterns that have what we call a vein, and I'm going to point to it over here. And new students have issues with how to put that on. So today, that's what my demo is all about. We're going to also show you some paper piecing demonstrations. Those will come probably tomorrow, and then we're going to show you how to do an S-curve to show you how to sew the two pieces together. And then the final demonstration, that video that we already have prepared, is going to show you how to put the binding and fold down the tips to finish up your placemats. Okay, I have notes here, and the reason I have to use the notes is to try to stay in order with what I'm going to teach you today. So we're going to pretend like we've already done all of our paper piecing. And in our instructions, once we finish the paper piecing, there's instructions that tell you you have to come in here and trim this exterior edge of the top side of Unit B, all right? On the inside of Unit B, we have the area in which we sew our vein onto. And that actually has a section. Actually, this one we didn't write it down as a section, but it's where the vein sits, okay? So what I'm going to do is, we've already trimmed this. So the next thing we have to do is, there's a line on here, a point that says transition point. Because we're working with an S-curve unit, we need to know where that point is. And later on, I'm going to explain to you what an S-curve is. So I want you to take a pencil, and you're going to just take this and mark a line there, straight, kind of parallel with that. And if it's not perfect, don't worry about it. You just have to know where that mark is at a later time. So then the next thing I'm going to show you is, in your instructions, it tells you that there's a basting stitch, and it says you have to sew a basting stitch. And the basting stitch that you're going to sew, it doesn't really matter what size stitch you use, because we're going to cut it off when we're all done with it, to get rid of bulk underneath our vein. Okay, so there's a line here, and the line is called basting stitch line 17. So if you look for that line, it's pretty easy to see where you're going to sew. And you just start on one edge and you just stitch that line, okay? And I'm going to flip it over, and now you're going to see where I sewed that line, and it's that red line right there, okay? After you get that sewn, then what we're going to do is trim this excess fabric away. The reason we use a basting stitch when we're doing a curved seam like this is because we don't have an add-a-quarter ruler that has a curve on it. We would have to build one for every single curve that we work with. And so we use the basting stitch, and that tells us where our seam allowance is, the edge of the seam allowance, or just like we had trimmed it. So once we have that basting stitch done, then we're going to come in here with our rotary cutter. And the first thing you're going to have to do, because in the process of paper piecing, we have a whole bunch of lines that were sewn into that area. And I just go through and I tear the paper right back where those lines are, so that it releases the paper from the fabric underneath it. And then we're going to take our rotary cutter and we're just going to trim along that edge. And it doesn't have to be perfectly trimmed. We just like to get rid of that excess. So don't worry about it if it's a little messy underneath there. It just makes it easier to handle if we get rid of all of that fabric. Okay, so it doesn't have to be perfect. If you accidentally cut the paper, don't worry about it. It's just paper, and in the long run, you're going to tear it off anyway, okay? So you don't want to cut it all off because we need it right now, but a hole in it's not going to matter. So when you're done, it's going to look like this. So see, here's my basting line, and here's the paper, okay? So remember I told you that you had to have that transition line. So we're going to flip it over, and I'm going to just lay a pin and put that right in that mark. So what that's telling me is that this is a curve and this is an inside curve. So I have a mirror image from these two curves, and they join at this point, and that's called an S curve. Now I'm going to take my vein here. And the vein is, we tell you to cut the vein 2 inches in the pattern, which is fine. You really can do this with 1.5 inches. And sometimes it's easier for people that are new to it, doing a curved vein like this, to work with a little bit thinner piece. So if you want to trim that down to 1.5 inches, you definitely can. So now what I have to do is figure out how this is going to fit. And I'm going to clip off just one end right here. There's not a lot of excess, so be a little bit careful. And I'm going to measure it along this edge to make sure I've got it to where it's going to fit. And I'm just slowly going to roll this around like this. And it looks like I'm in good shape here. So I'm going to flip this over, and I'm going to take my glue pen, and we're going to find, basically I'm just going to run this along like this, and I'm going to go back to that transition mark, and then I'm going to put some glue. And your glue is placed just right along the inside of that line. It's on the fabric, it's not on the paper. And then I'm just going to take this and I'm going to quickly press this fabric right along the edge of that seam, that stitch line, which is our basting line. And that's the whole reason why we did the basting line, is because we had to know where we could line that up. Okay, now this part, because I have to do an inside curve, is going to be a little bit tougher. And in your instructions, I actually tell you to come in and sew this before you do this next one, but I'm going to skip that because it'll speed things up a little bit. I'm going to put 2 or 3 pins in here to hold it, since I'm not going to sew it, because once that glue dries, it has a tendency to pop off. Okay, so now we've got that pin so it won't go anywhere. Now I'm going to take this and I'm going to run the glue. I'm going to try to keep my head out of the video here, or the camera. And I'm going to run this glue right along this edge. And if you're slow at this, your glue is going to dry before you get to the other side. So you might have to put more glue on it. Now notice I'm pulling a little bit because I've got to, this is an inside curve, so I've got to bring this around, and I'm gathering this part of it, but I'm having to stretch the outside of that vein, or it's my strip of fabric, which, by the way, this is cut on the bias. So now if you look at that, see how that's wanting to stand up like that? So I'm going to actually come in here with a pin, and I'm going to place a pin right along this edge so that that doesn't break loose there. If I go to an iron, I can actually steam that down and it'll lay perfectly flat there. It stretches it out, but then we're going to re-steam it and put it back in position. But right now, what I want to do is just put some pins in here. because I can accomplish the same thing with pens as I can with steam. And I'm going to put one more. Okay. All right. I don't think my iron's hot, so I'm not even going to attempt to use it for this part. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip this over. And on my paper, there's another line here, and it's called line 18, and that's my sew line. And I'm going to stitch my sew line. I use a size 70 needle when I'm doing foundation paper piecing. Most instructors are going to tell you to use either an 80 or a 90. We work with newsprint, and newsprint is much lighter weight than if you're using typing paper, which is a heavier weight paper. So the newsprint, it works really good with a lighter weight needle. Now you can use a size 80 needle. I prefer the 70 because it doesn't make as much noise as it's sewing through the paper. And since I'm sewing all day long on paper, I prefer not a quieter sound with my machine. So it's a little bit sharper. You want a sharp, don't use a ballpoint. Make sure it's a sharp, right? So we're going to place this right along that line, and we're going to sew on line 18. And if I can get to my pins, I'm going to pull them out as I go. Again, if you're stitching on this, you want to stay on that line the best you can. If you sway back and forth like a drunk driver going down the road, you're gonna notice that when you go to press that open, all right? So stay on the line and sew slowly. And notice how I'm lifting the paper, because if I do have any wrinkles underneath there, I want the feed dogs to pull that fabric through evenly. And if I put pressure on it, then I could end up with a little pleat. So I always lift my paper along that edge when I'm up away from the machine when I'm sewing any type of a curved seam with paper. Okay, so we've passed the transition point, and you should have your needle down, which I don't. Now I do, so that when you stop, it doesn't move back and forth. So once we pass that transition point, we're going to sew to the inside curve, which you have to sew a little bit slower, I'm sorry, on that one, because it's just, you're turning your machine a lot faster. And notice I'm picking up that fabric and paper underneath it. And I'm going to stop just for a second, and I'm going to tip my iron down and see if it'll heat up for me really quick, because we need the iron. Now we'll come and finish this seam. All right, so when we're done, we have this piece of fabric, and notice that it's too big, which that's fine. It needs to be too big. So now what I want to do is I'm going to take my glue pen, and I'm just going to press just a little bit, because I'm not sure my iron's going to steam this down for me. So I'm going to put just a little bit of glue along that edge of that stitch line. And then when I push this over, it'll hold that flat for me for right now. And that'll help in the process, okay? So now we're gonna go over to the iron and see if we can get this to steam down. And when you're working with that curve, just lift the iron just a little bit off of the paper so that as you run the steam over it, it starts shrinking that inside curve down. I'm going to do that just a little bit longer. I think that's going to be good enough there. All right. Now you can actually shrink that if you have a really nice steam iron to where it almost lays flat, but we're going to hurry through the demo here. All right. So now I'm going to flip this over and I'm going to grab a ruler. And we have a ruler that we designed for one of our other projects. And the ruler is called the Curved Diamond Cutting and Trimming Ruler. And one of the things we've figured out is that when you have a ruler that's has a little bit of an inside curve and an outside curve, it works really good for cutting around curved pieces, even though it's not the same radius as the curves that you're working with. You can still move it and and it's a lot safer to use and it works pretty slick. So I'm going to actually take this and start, and I'm just lining that up. And as I cut, I just continue to move this ruler into that line. I'm going to move this back a little bit so I can get my head out of the camera. And once I get to that transition point, then I'm going to flip the ruler over. And we have a couple of these rulers. One of them is a Creative Grids ruler that we call the wave ruler. And then we have this one that we use for one of our Technique of the Month patterns, but you can buy it without getting the pattern. And you will find it on sale on our website. Okay, so we have that. Now I'm going to trim the end of it. We're going to get rid of this stuff. And look how nice that is. Now I'm going to go back and I'm going to steam this down a little bit further. And I'm going to turn the video back to Sharon, and she's going to talk to you for a little bit while I prepare the next video.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Judy. That was really interesting. I'm sitting here with my nose pressed to the screen watching you do all of this. So great technique. Thank you for sharing it. It's been fantastic. I just saw a message come up where Kim Hammond said that she's never done any paper piecing before and that this demo is encouraging her to try. So that's certainly great news. And there's a lot of people out here that are also saying, me too, that's a nifty ruler. There's some questions about, are you cutting a 1/4 inch? I know somebody is answering some questions on your end. Is it Judelle that's answering the questions?
Probably Elise.
Oh, okay. So somebody's answering for Quiltworx. So if you have any questions, please, put the questions up there. Nancy Jewell is on for Free Spirit, and she is answering any questions that you have about Free Spirit fabrics. So fire the questions on in. We want to hear from you. Everyone's loving this, saying very cool ruler. They want to try it. So there's some really positive comments coming through, Judy. So I'm going to go back to you if you're ready. And
I'm ready.
okay.
Yeah.
And before I send it back to you, I just want to remind viewers that you're here with Inspired By with Free Spirit. And we are here this week with Judy Niemeyer, who is showing us how to make a tea time placemat. So back to you.
All right. So I am going to just kind of answer a couple of those questions. I think somebody wanted to know about the ruler. They are available on our website. And if you have questions, just send us a message and we will answer it and get you what you want. The other question that somebody said is, was I trimming with a 1/4 inch? Yes, I was using, when I did that final trim, the final trim was done on the line, but when we start working with the vein and things like that, you do have to have your 1/4 inch, but the final trim was on the line, right? And if you have questions and you don't understand it, send us an email and I'll take care of that tonight and send it back to you, okay? So the next thing that we have here is we have to sew these two pieces together. Now, before we can sew, we definitely have to remove the paper. You don't want to try to do curve piecing with the paper. Even if you have an instructor that tells you to leave it on, take it off, because paper was never intended to sew a curve. You can't roll it, and it doesn't work. That's all I'm going to say about it. Now, the other thing I want to point out is, remember we marked those transition lines? Well, after I marked those transition lines, I came back and I stitched it. One of them I did in white thread and you can't see it, and the other one is actually in some red thread, and I don't know if you can see it, but there's that transition line, and then my other one's here. So that transition line is extremely important when you're doing this, and once you remove the paper, you can't see it on the paper because it's in the garbage. So if you don't sew these transition lines or find some way to mark them, then you won't know how to fit this leaf together. So now that I have a transition line, all I have to do is just line that up and make sure that they're sitting on top of each other, and they are. And now there's no guessing how that's going to go together for you, right? So the first side I'm going to sew is actually the easy side. And we're going to start here at the pin where that transition point is, and we're going to run the glue right along the edge of the vein. We designed smart corners into all of our patterns. We started doing that about 3 years ago. So if you have older patterns, you're not going to have the smart corners, but smart corners are awesome. So I'm going to actually take and bring this back, and I'm going to match, because I know that that's a perfect match there. I don't have any dog ears showing there. I just have to match the end. And now I'm going to work back to the transition point. I don't want to stretch it. I'm actually going to kind of start easing it because it's cotton fabric, and cottons have a tendency to be a little bit looser fitting than a batik. So we're going to glue that down. See how nice that just fits along there? If you stretch that, and if we didn't start here and here and you start stretching it, sometimes you can end up with almost 1.5 to 2 inches hanging over the end. So whenever you're trying to fit something on a curve, always set your ends, find somewhere in the center, and work it together, all right? And you'll get good at it. Curves are not difficult. So now I'm going to actually sew this down, all right? Now something else I want to show you really quick that we do a lot is we have all these seams in here, okay? And those seams can be kind of bulky. I have a pair of scissors here, and it's a little curved pair of scissors for applique. If I'm worried about those seams being bulky, I can come in here with my applique scissors, that little curve, and I can clean those seams off. And when I'm done, it's going to lay down and press a lot nicer for me, okay?
Judy, when you go in and cut those, is there a certain width that you're leaving? Is it like 1/8 of an inch?
I usually start right along the edge, and I do it right before I sew, because if I don't, then those stitches are going to start backing off. And then I just work it out, and I just use the curve that's in the scissors. So it's pretty much the same as the scissors are.
Mm-hmm.
And you just start right along the edge where the last stitches are, and I just cut it up, and it just it really makes a difference on how nicely these will press. Now, something else that I did not demo, and I really need to go back and demo it for you. So let's set this aside. It just dawned on me, I forgot to show you. When we finish this piece over here, you're going to still have all of this excess fabric under there and the papers under it. So what I like to do, because that stitch line that we have, that basting stitch line, that's bulky. And you'll actually see that underneath your, when you go to put these leaves together and you start quilting them, you'll see that line. So what I do is I come in here and I cut just to the inside. So what I'm doing right now is trimming off that excess. So see what I'm trimming off? And I'm taking that basting line off. So it's leaving me a seam allowance that's going to run about just a little over 1/8 of an inch. And what that does for me is it allows me, when I get done, I'm able to actually press both the seams from the bane in on top of each other, and it just lifts that off a little bit. And then when you're quilting, you don't even have to quilt in the bane. All you have to do is just quilt along the bane, because both of your seams are going to be pressed in. So when I look at it, see how the seam's pressed in, and then we have to remove that paper, right? So now that we went back and showed you that, I'm going to actually show you the curved piecing. So I'm going to start right here at my pin, and I'm going to set my seam allowance, and this is a 1/4 inch seam allowance now. We're just going to sew along the edge.
Your machine's really quiet.
Okay, so now that I have half of that seam sewn, so this is where I'm going to explain an S curve to you, because an S curve is 2 mirror image curves. So you have one curve going like this, the other curve's going down. Where those join, that's your transition point. So a lot of people, when they're doing an S curve, they think they have to start and sew in and out. The best way to do an S curve is to start in the center where your transition is and sew out. And then you're going to flip it over. And now we're going to do another just normal curve instead of trying to get that inside curve. So now I'm going to glue this edge. I love glue. And if you're wondering why I didn't trim those excess seams off, it's just because I'm in a hurry, right? So now we're going to take this, we're going to find the end, and that's going to match perfectly because we designed it to match perfect. And I'm going to show you again how nice that matches right there. So there's nothing, there are no dog ears on this piece. And then we're just going to have to work this in, and you may have to pull in just a little bit to get that to fit along there, because that's that inside curve. And if you don't get that steamed down really flat in there, then it may be a little bit loose, but you won't notice it once you get that seam sewn. Okay, so now we're going to start at the transition point, and we're going to overlap the stitches, and we're going to sew the rest of this seam. But I do want to show you something. So as I start getting down towards this end, my pressure foot's going to jump up on top of this stitch, that seam allowance there, and it has a tendency to move. So right when I get there, what I'm going to do is fold that seam back so that I don't have to fight the pressure foot going up over the top. I'm just going to fold that back out of the way. All right, it gives me a lot smoother look. All right. Remember, you're going to overlap your stitches there at the transition point by about 1/2 inch. And then you're going to remove that pin. And now we're going to start our curve. I'm not holding this up now because I don't have the paper under it, and I want it to lay flat. And I'm just going to keep moving And what I'm doing here is I'm just pulling this back as I'm sewing along that curve. Okay, so now I'm in where I'm starting to go up over that seam. So I'm just going to lift my pressure foot and fold that seam back so I'm not fighting that. All right, so that looks really nice. So now what I'm going to do is come over here and I'm going to press that seam, and then I'll show you the finished piece.
Judy, I have a question for you while you're pressing.
Okay.
What did you call the corner? Did you call it a smart corner? Is that where the corners are cut straight?
So a smart corner is where when you sew two pieces together, a lot of times you end up with dog ears, like you'll have the ears come off. So a smart corner is where in the design process, Bradley flips all of the designs over on top of each other and he cleans all of those dog ears off.
Right.
And he can do that on curves as well. So even if you have these really funny curves, he can actually clean those curves off, and you know exactly, so there's no guesswork as to how you're going to position that. Now there's a ruler that I use, it's called, I have it with me. It's called the Deluxe Corner Trimmer, and it's from Marty Michelle. And this ruler, so these have these little smart corners on it, okay? And if you're doing anything like a 45 and 90, a 53 and a half, a 60, 120, and a 135, then you can trim all of your smart corners, okay? We use a lot of angles that don't fit within this. And so we actually do and put that design work right into the paper. But if you're working with a traditional standard pattern, most patterns are designed off of those normal angles. You can use this little ruler, and it's one of the best tools you'll ever buy. So,
That's
all right.
Yeah, that's a great tip. Thank you.
So here's our piece. It's all done. And now it's ready to be quilted.
It's beautiful.
We actually, if you're a great machine quilter, you can do some really fun stuff with this. I'm not a great machine quilter, so I just went in with lines. I can quilt, but I'm not I don't know how to do free motion.
Designer, Judy.
I can do line work, but no free motion. So see, all we did is I just did right in the ditch along here and then like this. But what's nice is these are small enough you can actually do them on your own machine. So
right. They're beautiful.
They're very easy to do. Okay. So our next video that we did last night for everybody actually shows you how to do the corners, how to put the binding on. So watch that. I was quite impressed with myself last night that I did such a perfect job on my corner. So anyway, watch that video when you get ready to do your binding, because it is a little difficult to figure out how to get those to fold around those tips. All right. I want to thank you guys for watching me today, and I'm going to give this back to Judelle and Sharon and let them finish up the presentation or the video or whatever we're doing.